The Obama administration began developing a pretext for military action in Syria more than a year before reports of sarin gas attacks in Syria began to surface.
A red line for us is we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized. We have communicated in no uncertain terms with every player in the region that that's a red line for us, and that there would be enormous consequences if we start seeing movement on the chemical weapons front.
Arming the rebels, that's an option. That's an option.
Now that the DC warlords had publicly declared chemical weapons in Syria a so-called red line, it became obvious that a strategy for military intervention was in place. Little doubt remained that DC would have the pretext it needed for war on Syria.
منين؟ كم صاروخ غنمتم؟
In 2011, what began in Syria as a series of protests organized by Syrian political activists soon turned violent, taking on an entirely different tone as foreign Islamic jihadists began pouring into the country. Heavily armed and funded by DC and its allies, the jihadists quickly set up shop and began a massive campaign of terror. Between June of 2012 and March of 2013, the rebel forces staged no less than 4 raids on Syrian military installations, capturing military-grade heavy weaponry. In mid-2012, unable to contain their fanatic exuberance, the jihadists began uploading countless videos documenting their firepower. The claim that only the Syrian government has the capability of launching a chemical weapons attack is ludicrous in the extreme.
Compress the feelings of the people in the country. Only 11% of the public, according to the Daily Telegraph this morning, support Britain becoming involved in a war in Syria.
The noes to the left, 285.
British Prime Minister David Cameron has lost a parliamentary vote on possible military action against Syria.
On Sunday, French Interior Minister Manuel Valls said that France will not launch an assault on Syria alone.
A UN measure which would have authorized the use of military force in Syria has been rejected.
Wir haben für die deutsche Seite ansonsten deutlich gemacht, an militärischen Aktionen werden wir uns in keinem Falle beteiligen.
The American public just isn't buying it. I mean, they're not buying this belief that if we engage in military strikes on Syria, that's not going to lead to boots on the ground, and it's not going to lead to this kind of prolonged military engagement like we've seen in Iraq and we've seen in Afghanistan.
Syrians are crossing the border right now in record numbers. Why? Because they fear that the Americans are going to bomb Damascus.
In New York City, those opposed to war chanted, "We need jobs, we need peace, US out of the Middle East."
When you've got 97% of your constituents saying no, it's kind of hard to say yes. Why should members of Congress go against the will of their constituents and support your decision on this? If Congress fails to authorize this, will you go forward with an attack on Syria?
I trust my constituents want me to offer my best judgment. That's why they elected me. That's why they re-elected me, even after there were some decisions I made that they disagreed with. An administration uses various hooks to suggest that American interests were directly threatened.
Once the Kremlin confirmed that the DC warlords were planning a unilateral strike on Syria, in spite of the United Nations' refusal to authorize the use of military force, the Russian bear began issuing warnings against military intervention. Moscow's deployment of a fleet of Russian warships to the Mediterranean Sea underlined the seriousness of these warnings.
Things are also heating up in the Mediterranean. Russia is sending its warships in. Russia's absolute refusal to back military intervention in Syria remains.
Moscow has been critical of the U.S. chemical weapons claims, saying it's failed to present verified evidence that President Assad deployed the toxic arsenal.
Russian military officials say the country is sending 3 more naval vessels to the eastern Mediterranean in the wake of a possible U.S. strike on Syria.
Only the UN Security Council could sanction the use of force against a sovereign state. Any other pretext or method which might be used to justify the use of force against an independent sovereign state is inadmissible and can only be interpreted as an aggression.
The DC warlords, in their eagerness to continue the campaign of destabilization and acquisition in the Middle East, badly miscalculated their ability to manufacture support for a Syrian invasion. The empire's cliched war rhetoric falls on ears still ringing from the decade-long war on the Middle East. Frustrated by the negative response from a war-weary American public and a skeptical international community, the DC warlords take on a more aggressive tone. September 24, 2013, the 68th session of the United Nations General Assembly, New York. Barack Obama, CEO and public relations liaison for the DC warlords, addresses representatives from the 193 member states in an attempt to goad them into submission.
If we cannot agree even on this, then it will show that the United Nations is incapable of enforcing the most basic of international laws. It's time for Russia and Iran to realize that insisting on Assad's rule will lead directly to the outcome that they fear, an increasingly violent space for extremists to operate.
The idea that attacking Syria will somehow reduce the ability of the foreign Islamic jihadists to operate in Syria is obviously ridiculous. If the DC warlords remain true to form, then Obama's comments can only be interpreted to mean that if the UN insists on standing in the way of an attack on Syria, then the DC-funded and armed foreign Islamic jihadists, the extremists, will escalate the violence. Whether or not Syria has dodged the DC Empire's bullet remains to be seen. The historically likely scenario is that the violence in Syria will escalate even further, and the mainstream media will obediently continue to propagandize the war in Syria in favor of the jihadists, providing the DC warlords another window of opportunity in the near future.
An administration uses various hooks to suggest that American interests were directly threatened.